Welcome, Bernd Debusmann, ArabianBusiness.com's reporter in Washington, D.C. Can you just give us a little bit of an overview for anybody waking up or logging on and working out what's going on in the election? Can you give us a brief summation of what the picture looks like now?
Well, it really depends on where you look. The different channels, for example, have it slightly different. Biden is still ahead, but it's been much narrower than I think anyone, at least in the Biden camp, really predicted. For example, in Florida and in a lot of other states where there was kind of a blue wave expected to carry Biden to a surprise victory, that didn't really pan out as expected. So I think, a lot of Republicans are now feeling a little more cautiously optimistic, but there's still a long way to go. And I don't think we'll get the results tonight, actually. And I think, there's still quite a good pathway for Biden to win if you actually sit down and do the math. If he pulls out victories in, for example, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Minnesota, states like that, he could still win. But it is much more uncomfortable for a lot of people in the Democratic camp than I think they were kind of looking forward to. It's not the sweep that many of them seem to have hoped for.
How similar is this then in many ways to 2018 and the midterm elections, where at roughly the same point of the cycle, we were looking at Republicans holding on to a lot of congressional seats, a lot of congressional districts seemed to be favoring Trump. But then as the days went on, when more and more ballots were counted, that's when the blue wave actually did take effect. So on the night, it looked a little bit lukewarm for the Democrats. But then 2, 3, 4 days later, when all of the votes were counted, when all of the results were in, actually it turned out to be a landslide. Are we going to be looking at something like that when all the votes are counted in those states you mentioned, like particularly Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin?
I think that that's very possible, especially in Pennsylvania. I mean, that's such a big win that they need. And there's still so much left to do, and they've stopped counting today. Of course, I think the difference this year from 2018 is the pandemic. I think it kind of skewed the results. At the beginning, the Democrats seemed to be doing pretty well at the beginning of the night because mail-in votes were counted earlier in some places. And then the Republicans caught up, and I think that's when you started seeing a sense of panic almost in some of the Democrats on television, for example. But yeah, I think it is kind of like that the ebbs and flows of this, people weren't necessarily expecting that. And I think this could still flow towards the Democrats. And I think, there is a sense of panic right now, but I don't think it's necessarily all that warranted yet.
And I think that's something that really has to be explained, doesn't it? Is that every single state has its own rules, it has its own processes. And in some states, they count the absentee and early and mail-in voting first. And in some states, like Pennsylvania, crucially, they count them at the end. And I think there's two things that we probably need to note from this point here is more people have voted early or by mail than in any election in history. I think it's almost 2/3 of the vote would have been cast before Election Day. And then the second part of that is this is when the courts will come into play, isn't it?
It will, and I think the longer it takes for us to get those results from Pennsylvania, for example, the Trump campaign has already signaled a willingness to go in with their lawyers. That was his exact phrase. So the longer this takes, the more contentious it gets, the more litigious it'll get. That just it makes it a more combative election than it would have been if there was no pandemic and this wasn't the case.
What do you think the big take home is then? We did a column with Anthony Scaramucci a couple of days ago. And he said that whatever the result, there is going to be this block of disaffected, disillusioned, and essentially distrustful voters that Biden, if he wins, is going to have to re-engage and bring back into the system. It seems that we are certainly as divided as ever before in America. And that the big take home is that the social and cultural divide in America hasn't been bridged in this election, and it will be a fairly large gulf between those two sides, whoever wins.
I completely agree with that. I think, for example, if Biden does win, there'll be a lot of and I think he knows it as well, because throughout the campaign, his messaging was that he'll be a president for all Americans if he wins. I mean, he's been repeating this over and over and over. And that says to me that he knows he has to reach out to some of these people that are very hardcore Trump supporters. If Trump wins, I think it works the same way, though. For example, here in Washington, D.C., a city that's deeply mistrustful, almost hostile to him in every way. If he wins, you know, I mean, I suppose politically it's not too crucial for him, but in places like DC, Philadelphia, Chicago, where he's a deeply unpopular person, California, you know, at some point they have to start reaching out to start mending these fences. The Biden campaign seems a little more willing to do that, at least for now. I mean, Trump, as we said earlier, he's polling better with people that it's perhaps counterintuitive to think that they might support him, Latino voters, women, but he's done better this time than last time with a lot of those demographics.
You're in America, you're on the ground there. Obviously you're in DC, which probably isn't necessarily representative of most of Trump country or any of Trump country really. In 2016, you could kind of understand Trump's appeal as this kind of outsider maverick against the establishment figure of Clinton, the ultimate Washington insider, someone who was easily characterized, fairly or unfairly, as someone who was kind of matriarchal and kind of potentially a sort of superior, and someone that didn't understand the needs of everyday Americans struggling. And you could understand why Trump would be popular or would resonate with this outside message in places like the Rust Belt. But we've had 4 years of Trump, and we've had the pandemic, and we've had what many people would say as a botched response to the pandemic. He seems to have alienated an awful lot of groups in America that would be traditionally Republican voters, such as the military and places like that. How do you explain his strong showing at the polls today? Even whether he wins or loses, he's still going to get 46, 47, 48% of the vote.
Well, for one, I think even though he's been in the White House now for 4 years, he's still in a position where he can paint people like Joe Biden as career politicians, which, you know, his main message for the last 4 years is he's not that. He's not a career politician. He's not been there for 47 years like Joe Biden has. I think that's a very important factor. And I think also it's just a testament to, I mean, I think a lot of people didn't notice it, but his campaign, especially after he recovered from coronavirus, was extremely energetic. And he was able to paint Joe Biden, fairly or unfairly, as Sleepy Joe. You know, he wasn't having these big events. He wasn't blitzing across 5 states in one day. He had a much more measured approach to the campaign. And I think now the Democrats, depending on how this goes, they'll be asking themselves, A, was our campaign strategy effective? And B, was Joe Biden even the right candidate to take on someone like Trump, who can paint him as, you know, very much characteristic of the DC elite.
The swamp, as he would call it. So it's coming up to 10 o'clock in Dubai time. It's well past midnight where you are now. As you go to bed tonight, what's your feeling of where we are? Where will we end up on, say, Friday?
Well, I think we'll end up, it's very possible we end up with Biden still ahead on Friday. But I think by that point, the Trump campaign will be in a position where they can say, this shouldn't have happened, that shouldn't have happened, we shouldn't have waited this long to count these votes. And I think it'll work its way through the court system. I don't think this process will be over by the end of this week. And I think it's also very possible that at some point over the next few days, President Trump declares a win, even if it's not necessarily mathematically warranted just yet. I think if he, you know, wins some of these key states that are still in contention, he will say that, you know, I'm the winner here, and there's no need to drag this out any further. And that's where the real battle will begin. And in that time, the longer that drags out, the more potential there is for problems on the streets, demonstrations, riots. You know, in DC this morning, they were already saying that if Trump declares victory, they're not going to leave from around the White House anytime soon. So I think, you know, the longer this drags out, the more problems there'll be of those sorts as well.
So whatever the result, really, we are in for a period of political instability, shall we say?
I think so. I think it'll be messy in a way that Americans haven't ever experienced before. Today was much more calm than I think a lot of people were expecting. There wasn't really the sorts of voter intimidation, and I mean, there was incidents here and there, but nothing major. But I think, as this drags on, you'll see Americans experiencing something that they haven't necessarily ever had to deal with, that I think many of them probably associated with other countries that never really expected to happen here, unfortunately for them.